The letter fell from Alira Vance's hand the moment she read the line that named her the one who must choose. She had expected to advise. She had not expected to decide. Duke Alden Whitmore stood across the study, watching her face change. He had called her here at dawn, before the household woke, because he trusted no one else with this task. His father had died only weeks ago, and now 3 deeds sat on the desk between them, each one a house, each one a life he might live. "You want me to pick where you will spend the rest of your days," Alira said, her voice careful. "That is not a small thing to ask of a companion you hired 6 months ago." "You see things I do not," Alden answered. "My mother trusted your judgment before she died. I choose to trust it now." Alira looked down at the papers. 2 of the deeds described handsome properties near the capital. Gardens kept trim, roofs sound, staff already in place. The 3rd deed was different. The ink describing it was old, the paper yellowed at the edges, and beside the name of the estate, someone had written a single word in the margin. A word that had been scratched out, but was still faintly readable. "Avoid." "What is Ashcombe Manor?" she asked. Alden's jaw tightened. "A house my family stopped speaking of a generation ago. My grandfather died there. After that, no one lived in it again. Then why is it still in the family's name?" "Because selling it would mean explaining why we left it standing empty for 30 years, and no one has ever wanted to give that explanation." Alira set the deed down and picked it up again. Something about the way Alden avoided her eyes told her this was not simple grief talking. There was fear in the room, old and carefully hidden fear, and it had nothing to do with ghosts. "I would like to see it," she said. "No one goes there. You just told me I am the one who chooses. If I am to choose wisely, I need to see what I am choosing between." Alden studied her for a long moment, then he nodded, slowly, as though giving permission to something he half wished he could refuse. They left before the rest of the house stirred, taking a small carriage with only one driver, a quiet man named Peter who had served the family for years, and asked no questions. The road to Ashcombe wound through hills that grew wilder the further they traveled, the neat hedgerows near the capital giving way to overgrown fields and crooked fences. By the 2nd hour, Alira noticed that Peter had stopped speaking entirely, his hands gripping the reins tighter than before. "Is something wrong?" she asked him. "Just don't like this road, miss," he said. "Never have." The manor appeared at the top of a hill just as the light began to fade, and Alira felt her breath catch despite herself. Ashcombe was enormous, built of gray stone that had once been beautiful and was now streaked black in places, as though fire had touched it long ago and never been fully cleaned away. Ivy had claimed one entire wing, pulling at the windows like fingers trying to reach inside. The front gate hung crooked on a single hinge. "It looks like it is waiting for something," Alira said quietly. "Don't say things like that," Alden muttered, though he could not look away either. They approached on foot, the carriage left at the base of the hill. As they neared the entrance, a figure stepped out from behind a broken pillar, and Alira's hand flew instinctively to Alden's arm. The man was old, his coat patched many times over, his eyes sharp despite the lines carved deep into his face. "You should not be here," he said. "I am Duke Alden Whitmore. This is my family's land." The old man's expression flickered, something between respect and dread. "Then you are the first Whitmore to stand on it in 30 years, and I would ask you to be the last." "Who are you?" Alira asked. "Josiah Bram. I have kept this house from falling to ruin since before you were born, sir, though the family never asked me to, and never paid me a coin for it." Alden frowned. "Why would you stay somewhere you clearly believe is dangerous?" Josiah's eyes moved toward the manor's darkened windows before answering. "Because someone had to make certain the truth stayed buried with the stone, and someone had to be here in case a Whitmore ever came back asking the right questions." Alira felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the evening air. "What truth?" Josiah shook his head. "Not tonight. It is nearly dark, and you should not walk these halls after the sun is gone. Come back tomorrow, in daylight, and I will show you what I can." Alden wanted to press further, but Alira touched his sleeve gently, a signal to wait. They returned to the small inn in the nearest village, a modest place with low ceilings, and a fire that smoked more than it warmed. Over a plain supper, Alden finally spoke what had clearly been sitting heavy in his chest the entire ride. "My grandfather was found dead in the east wing of that house. They said his heart simply stopped. He was not an old man, Alira. He was younger than I am now." "And no one questioned it?" "My grandmother refused to discuss it. My father refused to discuss it. I was a child, and children are not told such things, only warned to stay away from certain rooms in certain houses." Alira turned her cup slowly on the table, thinking. A house like that does not become forbidden because a man's heart stopped naturally. Families do not abandon land worth this much money over ordinary grief. You think something else happened? I think Josiah Bram has spent 30 years guarding a secret, and I do not believe secrets like that stay guarded out of loyalty alone. Someone wanted that truth to remain hidden, and someone else has been making certain it never fully disappears. Alden looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something between fear and a strange, reluctant hope. You want to choose Ashcombe? I have not chosen anything yet, but I do not think you will ever feel settled in a comfortable house near the capital while this place sits here, half burned, half forgotten, holding whatever happened to your grandfather inside its walls. A man cannot build a new life while an old wound stays open behind him. He said nothing for a long while, staring into the smoking fire. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters of the small inn, and somewhere in the distance a dog began to bark and would not stop. There is something else, Alden said finally, his voice lower now. My grandmother is still alive. She lives quietly on a small property 2 days from here, and she has not spoken my grandfather's name aloud in my presence even once in my entire life. Then perhaps it is time someone asked her to. She will not welcome the question. Most people who carry a secret for 30 years do not welcome the person who finally asks them to set it down. That does not mean the asking should be avoided. Alden studied her across the table, the firelight catching the determination in her eyes, and for the first time since his father's death, something in him steadied. He had spent the last month drowning in decisions that felt hollow, choosing between fabrics and staff and which house looked most respectable to visitors. This felt different. This felt like the first real choice in front of him. Tomorrow, he said, we go back and we let Josiah Bram tell us whatever he has been waiting 30 years to say. And after that? After that, I think we visit my grandmother, whether she welcomes it or not. Alira allowed herself a small, tired smile. Then I suppose Ashcombe has already made its choice for us. Alden did not answer, but he did not disagree either. Outside, the dog finally stopped barking, and the village fell into an uneasy silence, the kind that settles over a place holding its breath for morning. Neither of them slept well that night. Alira lay awake listening to the wind, turning over Josiah's words in her mind. Someone had to be here in case a Whitmore ever came back asking the right questions. It was not the sentence of a man guarding an empty house from thieves or decay. It was the sentence of a man guarding a secret from the very family who owned the land, waiting 3 long decades for someone brave enough, or foolish enough, to finally ask. In the room beside hers, Alden stared at the ceiling and thought of his grandfather, a man he barely remembered except as a warm laugh and a pair of strong hands lifting him onto a horse. He had always been told the man died peacefully. Now, for the first time, he wondered if peace had anything to do with it at all. By the time the sun rose pale and thin over the hills, both of them were dressed and ready long before breakfast was served, each privately certain that whatever waited at Ashcombe Manor would change everything they thought they knew about their own family. At the table downstairs, Peter the driver was already waiting, though he did not look rested either. He had slept badly too, he admitted, when Alira asked. He said the village people spoke of the manor in low voices, always glancing toward the hill as though it might hear them. What do they say? Alira asked. Peter hesitated, stirring his tea, though he had not touched a drop of it. They say a fire started in one room only, on the night the old Duke died, and that no other room in the house was touched, not even the one beside it. They say Josiah Bram was the only person who went inside afterward, and that he came out a different man than he went in. Alden set down his cup. No one has ever told me that. Would you have wanted them to, sir, when you were a boy? Alden had no answer for that. They finished the short meal quickly, none of them with much appetite, and set out again toward the hill while the morning mist still clung low over the fields. The manor looked less frightening in daylight, though no less sad, its broken windows catching the pale sun like tired eyes. Josiah was already standing at the gate when they arrived, as though he had been waiting there since the previous evening. You came back, he said, and there was something almost like relief in his voice, buried beneath the caution. We said we would, Alden replied. Josiah studied them both for a long moment, then turned toward the manor's broken door. Then I suppose it is time you saw the room no one has entered in 30 years. Alira felt her pulse quicken as she followed him across the overgrown courtyard, Alden close beside her, neither of them speaking, both of them bracing for whatever truth had been waiting, patient and silent, inside those blackened walls. The door to the east wing groaned as Josiah pushed it open, and the smell hit Alira first, old smoke that had never fully left the stone, mixed with damp and years of stillness. Alden stopped walking the moment he crossed the threshold, his face pale. "This is where it happened," he said, not a question. "This is where they told you it happened," Josiah corrected. "There is a difference, sir, and you are about to understand why." He led them down a narrow corridor, past rooms with furniture still covered in cloth, untouched for 3 decades, thick dust rising with every footstep. At the end of the hall stood a door blackened with old fire, its frame warped from heat. Josiah placed his hand against it but did not open it right away. "Before I show you this," he said, "I need you to understand something. Your grandfather was not a careless man. He did not fall asleep with a candle burning. He did not knock over a lamp. I knew him well, and I have spent 30 years trying to make sense of what I found, and I still cannot make it fit the story your family was told." "Then what did you find?" Alira asked. Josiah pushed the door open. The room inside was small, clearly once a private study, and the fire had scorched everything black, the walls, the ceiling, the remains of a desk collapsed in the corner. But what caught Alira's eye immediately was the far wall, where a large portrait had once hung. The frame remained, twisted and burned, but the canvas itself had been cut away, not burned, cut, the edges too clean and straight to have been caused by flame. "Someone removed that painting before the fire started," Alira said slowly. "Yes," Josiah confirmed. "Who was in it?" "The old Duke, your grandfather, sir, standing beside 2 other men, business partners of his, from London. I only saw it a handful of times before it disappeared, but I remember their faces well enough." Alden stepped closer to the burned frame, running his fingers near the edge without touching it. "You think one of them started this fire?" "I think someone wanted that painting gone before anyone else could see who stood in it, and I think whoever wanted it gone was willing to let your grandfather die to make certain of it." The words settled heavy in the room, and for a moment none of them spoke. Somewhere above them, a loose shutter banged once against its frame, and Alira felt her whole body tense at the sudden sound. "Why did you never tell anyone this?" Alden asked, his voice tight. "I tried," Josiah said. "I went to your father, not long after it happened. He was young then, grieving, and he told me to never speak of it again. He said the family had suffered enough without wild stories attached to it. I believed, for a long time, that he simply could not bear to hear it. Now I wonder if there was another reason." Alira looked at him sharply. "You think your father knew more than he let on?" "I think," Josiah said carefully, "that someone in this family has been paying to keep this house forgotten, and I do not believe it was out of grief alone." Alden's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Who would benefit from my grandfather's death?" "That," Josiah said, "is exactly the question I have been waiting 30 years for someone to finally ask." He led them out of the burned room, and further down the corridor, to a smaller chamber that had clearly served as some kind of office. Ledgers sat stacked on a shelf, their covers thick with dust but their pages intact. Josiah pulled one free and handed it to Alira. "I saved these the night of the fire, before anyone could destroy them along with everything else. I never understood the numbers well enough to make sense of them." "Perhaps you will." Alira opened the ledger carefully, scanning the neat columns of figures. Her eyes narrowed as she turned page after page, her mind working quickly. "These are payments," she said, "regular payments, going out from Ashcomb's accounts, for years before your grandfather died. Large sums, sent quarterly, to a name I do not recognize." Alden leaned over her shoulder to look. "What name?" "Cassandra Pride," Alira read aloud. "That is your relative, is it not? The one who has been pressing you to sell this estate quickly?" Alden's face went very still. "She would have been a young woman then, barely more than a girl. Young enough to seem harmless," Alira said. "Old enough to understand exactly what money could buy her, and exactly what silence was worth." Josiah's eyes widened slightly at the name. "I never saw her here, not once, in all my years." "That does not mean she was never involved," Alira said. "It only means she was careful." They spent the next hour moving through the ledgers, Alira reading figures aloud, while Alden and Josiah listened in growing silence. The payments to Cassandra Pride stopped abruptly the same year the old Duke died, and after that, no further entries appeared at all, as though whoever managed the accounts had simply stopped writing anything down, or had made certain nothing further would ever be recorded. "There is a gap here," Alira said, pointing to a torn page near the back of the ledger. "Someone removed pages after this point." "Recently?" Alden asked. Josiah shook his head slowly. "I would have noticed if anyone came back to tamper with these books. I have kept this room locked for 30 years. Then whoever tore these pages did it before the fire," Alira said. Before your grandfather died, someone was already covering their tracks. Alden straightened, his expression hardening into something Alira had not seen from him before, a quiet, controlled anger that reminded her, suddenly, that beneath his gentle manner he carried real strength. I want to know everything. Every payment, every name, every gap in these records. If my grandfather was wronged, I intend to find out exactly how, and by whom. That may not be a safe wish, sir, Josiah warned. Whoever did this waited 30 years to feel secure enough that no one would ever ask. If they learn someone is asking now, they may not sit quietly and wait to be found. Let them come then, Alden said. I would rather face danger honestly than spend the rest of my life living in a lie built to protect someone else's guilt. Alira watched him with something close to admiration, though she kept it from her voice. We will need more than ledgers to prove any of this. We need to speak with your grandmother. If Cassandra was involved, your grandmother may know things she has never dared to say aloud. She has refused to discuss my grandfather's death my entire life. Then perhaps, Alira said gently, she has simply been waiting for someone to ask the right question, the way Josiah has been waiting 30 years for a Whitmore brave enough to walk back through that door. Josiah closed the ledger slowly, holding it against his chest as though it were something precious, something he had guarded far longer than made sense for a man with no obligation left to the family that had abandoned this house. I will show you one more thing, he said, before you leave. Something I have never shown anyone. He led them outside, around the back of the manor, to a small overgrown garden hidden behind a crumbling wall. In the center stood a simple stone marker, half swallowed by ivy, no name carved into it, only a date. What is this? Alden asked. The night of the fire, before help arrived, I found something in the ashes of that study. Josiah said quietly. A ring, half melted, but I recognized the crest. It did not belong to your grandfather. I buried it here because I did not know what else to do with proof I could not explain, and I was afraid that if the wrong person learned I had found it, I would be the next name added to this family's silence. Alira crouched beside the marker, studying it carefully. You believe this ring belonged to whoever started the fire. I believe, Josiah said, that your grandfather was not alone in that room when it began to burn, and I believe whoever was with him left something behind in their hurry to escape. The wind moved through the overgrown garden, rustling the ivy across the stone, and Alira felt, for the first time since arriving at Ashcombe, that the manor was not simply holding a sad memory within its walls. It was holding evidence, patient and undisturbed, waiting 3 long decades for someone willing enough to dig. I want to see the ring, Alden said quietly. Josiah hesitated, then knelt beside the marker and began working the loose earth away with careful hands, as though he had done this once before and knew exactly how deep to go. After a moment, his fingers found a small cloth bundle, wrapped tightly and tied with twine long since brittle with age. He handed it to Alden without a word. Alden unwrapped it slowly. Inside lay a ring, its band twisted from heat, the stone at its center cracked but still holding a faint blue color. Pressed into the metal, barely visible beneath the damage, was a crest Alira did not recognize, a bird with its wings spread wide over a small shield. Do you know this crest? She asked Alden. He turned the ring over in his palm, studying it. No, it is not my family's mark, and it is not any crest I have seen among our regular acquaintances. Then it belongs to someone outside your usual circle, Alira said. Someone connected to your grandfather through business perhaps, rather than family or friendship. The men in the painting, Josiah said suddenly. The 2 who stood beside your grandfather in the portrait that was cut away. I never learned their names, but I remember your grandfather spoke of them often in his final months. Business partners from London, as I told you, men he had grown uneasy about near the end. Uneasy how? Alden asked. Josiah's face darkened with the effort of memory. He mentioned money owed, disagreements over some venture that had gone badly. I overheard him once, arguing with someone in this very study, though I never saw who it was. He told me, only a few days before the fire, that he intended to end his partnership with them entirely. Alira felt the pieces beginning to shift into place, though the full picture remained frustratingly out of reach. If your grandfather planned to cut ties with these men, and if Cassandra Pride was receiving payments that stopped the same year he died, then perhaps she was not acting alone. Perhaps she was connected to these business partners in some way we have not yet uncovered. You think she conspired with them, Alden said. I think it is far too early to say for certain, Alira admitted, but I do not believe in coincidence, not when the timing lines up this precisely. Money flowing to your relative stops the exact year a fire kills your grandfather, and destroys the one painting that could identify the men he was arguing with. That is not chance, that is design. Alden closed his fist around the ring, the metal cool against his palm despite the warmth of the afternoon sun now filtering through the overgrown garden. I need to speak with my grandmother. If anyone in this family knows the truth behind these business dealings, it will be her. She may not welcome the ring, Josiah warned. If she recognizes that crest, it could bring back memories she has spent 30 years trying to bury as deeply as I buried this garden marker. I understand that, Alden said, but I cannot continue pretending this house does not exist, and I cannot choose a home for myself while my grandfather's death remains an open wound no one has ever dared to examine. Whatever pain this causes her, I believe the truth deserves to be spoken at last. Josiah studied him for a long moment, and something in his weathered face softened, as though he were seeing, for the first time in 30 years, a Whitmore who might finally finish what his grandfather had started. Then I will keep this house standing a while longer, sir, and I will wait for whatever you bring back from her. Elira wrapped the ring carefully in its cloth bundle and placed it in her bag, determined to keep it safe until they reached the Dowager Duchess. As they made their way back down the hill toward the waiting carriage, the manor seemed to watch them go, its broken windows catching the afternoon light, like eyes finally allowed to close after decades of restless waiting. None of them spoke during the walk, each turning over the same unspoken question, wondering what price the truth might demand before it was finally allowed to surface after 30 long years of careful, deliberate silence. A carriage was already waiting outside Alden's townhouse when they returned, and the sight of it made his stomach tighten before he even saw the crest painted on its door. Lady Cassandra Pride stepped down before the driver could assist her, her expression sharp and composed, as though she had been rehearsing this arrival for hours. "Cousin," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I heard you rode out to Ashcombe. I came the moment I learned it." Alden kept his face carefully still, though beside him, he felt Elira go very quiet, the way a person does when they are choosing each word with great care. "News travels quickly. News about that house always does," Cassandra said. "It is the sort of place people cannot help but whisper about, even after 30 years. I only hope you did not let its conditions sway your judgment. Surely you see there are far better choices available to you." "I have not made my choice yet," Alden said. "Then let me help you make it wisely." Cassandra's gaze flicked briefly toward Elira, cool and assessing. "That property has cost this family enough sorrow already. I would think you would want to be rid of it entirely, rather than pour good money into stone that has already claimed one Whitmore life." "You speak of it as though it frightens you," Elira said mildly. Cassandra's smile tightened. "I speak of it as someone who watched this family suffer, though I was young at the time and remember little beyond the grief that followed. I would spare my cousin any repeat of that pain, if he will allow me." "That is very generous of you," Alden said, his tone giving nothing away, considering how rarely we have spoken these past years. "Family is family, cousin, whatever the distance between us." She stayed only a few minutes longer, pressing him gently but firmly to consider selling Ashcombe outright, offering to help arrange a buyer she claimed to know, a merchant eager for land in that part of the country. Alden thanked her with careful politeness and gave no answer, watching her carriage pull away down the street until it disappeared around the corner. "She came remarkably fast," Elira said once they were alone again. "Too fast," Alden agreed. "Someone told her we rode out there. I did not send word to anyone. Peter, perhaps, or someone at the inn. Villages talk, and word travels faster than carriages when there is a story attached to it." Elira crossed her arms, thinking, "But it is not the speed that concerns me most. It is how eager she was to have you sell the house, and how quickly she offered a buyer already waiting." "You think the buyer does not exist?" "I think it is worth finding out whether he does, before you agree to anything," Elira said. "A woman who has been quietly collecting payments from this estate for years does not simply forget where that money came from. If Ashcombe is sold to a stranger, whatever remains buried in its walls, or in its ledgers, disappears along with the sale." Alden's expression darkened with understanding. "She wants it gone before we find anything more." "That is my fear, yes." They set out the following morning for the Dowager Duchess's estate, a smaller but well-kept property 2 days' journey north, chosen deliberately, Alden explained, by his grandmother after she left Ashcombe for the final time. The roads were rougher this direction, winding through forest thick enough that little light reached the ground beneath the trees, and Elira found herself watching the shadows more closely than she wanted to admit, still unsettled by how quickly Cassandra had appeared the day before. On the first night, staying at a modest roadside inn, Elira woke to the sound of voices below her window, Low and urgent, she rose quietly and looked down into the yard, where two men stood beside a horse she did not recognize, speaking in tones too hushed to carry the words, though one of them gestured sharply toward the road they had traveled that day. When one of the men turned his face briefly toward the moonlight, Elira caught the flash of something at his collar, a pin shaped like a bird with wings spread wide. The same crest as the ring. She woke Alden immediately, and by the time they reached the window together, the men had gone, their horses' hoofbeats already fading into the dark forest beyond the inn. "You are certain it was the same mark," Alden said. "I am certain," Elira answered. "A bird with its wings spread over a shield. It is not a common design, and I do not believe I would forget it after holding that ring in my own hands only yesterday. Then someone connected to whatever happened at Ashcombe is following us. Or watching to see where we go next," Elira said. "Either way, we are no longer investigating a quiet family sorrow. Someone believes we are close enough to something dangerous that they are willing to track our movements through the middle of the night." Neither of them slept well the remainder of that night, and they set out again before dawn, eager to put distance between themselves and whoever had stood in that inn yard. The second day's ride passed uneventfully, though Elira caught herself glancing behind them more than once, watching for a horse that never appeared again, though its absence brought little comfort. They arrived at the Dowager Duchess's estate in the late afternoon, greeted by a modest staff and led into a sitting room, where Wilhelmina Whitmore sat by a window, a shawl draped over her shoulders despite the mild weather. She was smaller than Alden remembered, her once dark hair now entirely silver, but her eyes were sharp and clear, and they fixed on Elira the moment she entered with an intensity that made the younger woman straighten instinctively. "Grandmother," Alden said, crossing the room to kiss her cheek. "I hoped you would receive us." "You have never visited without writing ahead," Wilhelmina said, studying him carefully. "Something has happened. We went to Ashcombe." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Wilhelmina's hands, folded in her lap, tightened visibly around the edge of her shawl, though her expression remained composed with practiced effort. "I asked you never to speak that name in my presence." "I know, grandmother, and I am sorry to break that request. But I believe something happened to grandfather that this family has never fully understood, and I do not think I can move forward, in choosing a home or in anything else, until I know the truth." Wilhelmina's gaze moved to Elira, cold and assessing. "Who is this young woman, and why does she look at me as though she already suspects what I am about to say?" "This is Elira Vance," Alden said. "She has been helping me since father's death, and it was her insight that led us to question what really happened at Ashcombe. I trust her completely." "Trust is a dangerous thing to give so freely to someone you barely know." "With respect, Your Grace," Elira said carefully, "I did not go looking for this. We found ledgers showing payments made from Ashcombe's accounts to Lady Cassandra Pride in the years before your husband's death, payments that stopped the same year he died. We found a portrait cut from its frame before the fire that killed him, a portrait showing him with two business partners whose identities no one now living seems to know, and we found this." She withdrew the cloth bundle from her bag and unwrapped the ring, placing it gently on the small table beside the Dowager Duchess's chair. Wilhelmina stared at it, and for a long moment she did not move at all, her breathing shallow and controlled, as though she were fighting to hold something back that had waited 30 years for exactly this moment to break free. "Where did you find this?" she finally whispered. "Buried in the garden behind the manor," Alden said. "Josiah Bram kept it hidden all this time." Wilhelmina reached out with a trembling hand and touched the ring, though she did not pick it up, as though even now, after so many years, she feared what contact with it might bring back. "I know this crest." "Whose is it?" Alden asked. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, something in her had changed. The careful composure of 30 years beginning, at last, to crack. "It belonged to a man named Edmund Farrow, one of your grandfather's business partners. He and his brother invested heavily alongside your grandfather in a shipping venture that failed badly, costing all three of them a great deal of money. Your grandfather believed Edmund had hidden funds from the venture rather than losing them honestly, and he intended to expose him publicly, whatever the cost to their partnership." "And Cassandra?" Elira asked gently. "How does she fit into this?" Wilhelmina's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Edmund Farrow courted her for a time. Before any of this happened, I always believed it was affection. I understand now it may have been something else entirely, a way to keep watch over the family from the inside, through a young relative eager for attention and money she did not otherwise have." "You knew this," Alden said, his voice breaking slightly, "and you never told anyone." I knew pieces, Wilhelmina said. I suspected far more than I could ever prove, and when your grandfather died in that fire, and Edmund Farrow disappeared from society entirely within the month, never to be heard from again, I understood enough to be afraid. I was a young widow with a son to protect, Alden. I made the only choice that felt safe to me. I told your father never to speak of it. I closed Ashcombe's doors, and I prayed the entire matter would simply fade into forgotten history. It did not fade, Elira said quietly. It only waited. Wilhelmina looked at her, and for the first time since they had arrived, something like relief passed across her tired face, as though 30 years of carried weight had finally found another set of hands willing to help hold it. Then I suppose, she said softly, it is time I finished telling you everything I was too frightened to say 30 years ago. She asked for tea before she began, and while the staff prepared it, she sat in silence, gathering the pieces of a story she had carried alone for far too long. When the cups were finally set before them and the door closed, she began to speak, slowly at first, as though testing whether the words would still come after so many years of refusing them. Your grandfather was not a suspicious man by nature, she said. He trusted easily, perhaps too easily, and Edmund Farrow understood exactly how to use that trust. They had known each other for years before the shipping venture began, and I remember your grandfather speaking of him warmly, calling him a man of honor. I never fully shared that opinion. There was something in Edmund's manner that unsettled me, a way he had of watching a room rather than simply being in it. Did you ever say so to grandfather? Alden asked. Once, Wilhelmina admitted. He laughed at my concern and told me I worried too much about men I did not understand. I did not raise it again. A wife learns, sometimes wrongly, when her husband no longer wishes to hear her caution. 41. Elira leaned forward slightly. And the brother, your grace? You mentioned Edmund had a brother involved as well. Gareth Farrow, Wilhelmina said, the name clearly bitter on her tongue even after 30 years. Quieter than Edmund, and in some ways more dangerous for it. He rarely spoke in company, but he managed the venture's accounts, and I have always believed he was the one who first hid the missing funds, long before your grandfather discovered anything amiss. Edmund had the charm. Gareth had the patience, and patience, I have learned, can be a far more frightening quality than charm ever was. What happened when grandfather confronted them? Alden asked. Wilhelmina's hands tightened around her teacup. I do not know precisely. He told me only that he intended to expose the missing funds publicly, and that he had already written to a solicitor in London to begin the process. He seemed almost relieved to finally act, as though the suspicion had weighed on him more than he ever admitted. 3 days later he rode to Ashcombe to review the estate's own ledgers, wanting every figure in order before he made his accusations formal. He never returned. The room fell silent except for the soft crackle of the fire. Elira watched the Dowager Duchess carefully, noting how her composure held even as her voice trembled beneath it, a woman who had rehearsed grief so many times it had become a kind of armor. You believe the Farrow brothers followed him there, Elira said gently. I believe it now more than I ever allowed myself to before, Wilhelmina said. At the time, I told myself it was accident, misfortune, the cruel randomness that sometimes visits even careful men. It was easier to believe that than to imagine my husband had been deliberately silenced to protect 2 men's stolen fortune. But when Edmund vanished from society so completely, so suddenly, within weeks of the fire, and when Cassandra, who had seemed so devoted to him, suddenly severed all connection to his name and never spoke of him again, I could no longer pretend the timing was innocent. Did you ever ask her directly? Alden asked. Once, Wilhelmina said, not long after your grandfather's death. She wept, and told me Edmund had abandoned her cruelly, breaking her heart without explanation. I believed her then, or perhaps I simply wanted to. Grief makes fools of even careful people, Alden, and I had little strength left to question anyone further. Elira thought of the ledger pages, the payments made quarterly to Cassandra Pride beginning that very year, and continuing steadily until the fire. Your Grace, if Cassandra was truly abandoned and heartbroken, it seems strange that money continued flowing from Ashcombe's accounts into her hands for years afterward. Heartbreak does not typically come with regular payment. Wilhelmina's face paled further. I managed the household accounts myself in those early years, before I handed the estate's affairs to stewards I trusted. I do not recall approving any such payments. Then, someone else authorized them, Alden said. Someone with access to the accounts who did not wish you to know. The steward at the time was a man named Oswin Caro, Wilhelmina said slowly, memory visibly working behind her eyes. He managed Ashcombe's finances directly for several years after your grandfather's death. before I finally closed the house entirely and dismissed the remaining staff. I trusted him completely. I never once thought to question his figures. Is he still living? Alira asked. I have no idea, Wilhelmina admitted. I have not spoken his name in decades, nor thought of him beyond the occasional passing memory of a competent, quiet man who never gave me reason for suspicion. Alden rose and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening garden beyond, his mind clearly working through the tangled threads they had uncovered in just 2 days. So we have Edmund Farrow, who vanished after the fire. Gareth Farrow, who managed the venture's accounts and may have hidden the missing funds long before grandfather discovered anything. Cassandra, who received payments that stopped precisely when grandfather died, and who is now pressing me urgently to sell Ashcombe before anyone digs further. And Oswin Caro, a steward who authorized those payments without grandmother's knowledge. It is a great deal to untangle, Wilhelmina said quietly, and I fear some of these threads may lead somewhere far more dangerous than an old woman's memory can safely follow. We saw men outside our inn 2 nights ago, Alira said. One of them wore a pin bearing the same crest as the ring Josiah kept buried all these years. Someone is watching us, Your Grace, closely enough to track our movements through the night. Wilhelmina's composure finally broke, just slightly, her hand rising to press against her chest as though steadying her own heart. Then, whatever protection this family believed 30 years of silence had bought us, it appears to have run out. We do not intend to stop now, Alden said firmly, turning back from the window. Whatever danger this brings, I would rather face it honestly than continue living beneath a lie built to shield men who murdered my grandfather and stole from this family for their own gain. Wilhelmina looked at her grandson for a long moment, something fierce and proud finally breaking through the grief that had governed her for so long. Then you have more courage than I managed to find at your age, Alden. And I am both frightened and grateful for it. Whatever help I can offer, whatever old letters or forgotten records remain in this house, they are yours. It is past time this family stopped running from Ashcombe's shadow and started demanding the truth it has always deserved. A servant burst into the sitting room without knocking, her face white with alarm, and the entire mood of the evening shattered in an instant. Your Grace, forgive me, but the stable boy says a rider came through the property line just now, watching the house from the tree line before turning back toward the main road. Alden was moving before the servant finished speaking, striding to the window and scanning the darkening grounds beyond. In the distance, barely visible against the fading light, a horse and rider disappeared into the forest, too far to identify but close enough that the message was clear. They followed us here, Alira said. Or, they already knew where my grandmother lived, Alden replied grimly, and were simply waiting to see if we would come. Wilhelmina rose from her chair with more energy than she had shown all evening, calling for the household to secure the doors and windows, her voice steady despite the fear now evident in her eyes. I will not have my grandson harmed under my own roof after 30 years of silence finally being broken. Whoever is watching us will find this house well guarded tonight. They remained awake long past midnight, the staff doubled at every entrance, Alden pacing the length of the sitting room while Alira reviewed the ledger pages once more by candlelight, searching for any mention of Oswin Caro beyond the payments already discovered. No further riders appeared, and by dawn, exhaustion finally overtook caution, and the household settled into an uneasy stillness. It was Wilhelmina who found the first real thread the following morning, emerging from a locked drawer in her private study, with a small bundle of letters tied together with faded ribbon. I had forgotten these existed, she admitted, setting them on the table before Alden and Alira. Correspondence from Oswin Caro, written to me in the years after I dismissed him from Ashcombe's service. He wrote several times, asking to be reinstated, though I never answered any of them. I believed, at the time, that he simply missed steady employment. Reading them again now, I wonder if there was something else behind his persistence. Alira untied the ribbon carefully and began reading through the letters, each one polite on its surface but growing increasingly desperate in tone as they progressed. The final letter, dated nearly 5 years after the fire, contained a line that made her go very still. Listen to this, she said, reading aloud. I understand your reluctance to speak with me further, Your Grace, but I must insist that certain matters remain unresolved between us, matters that concern not only my own conduct, but the conduct of others who I fear may yet cause this family further harm, should the truth of Ashcombe's final accounts ever surface. He is warning her, Alden said, or threatening her. Perhaps both, Alira said. A man desperate enough to write that plainly, 5 years after being dismissed, was carrying something heavy enough that he could not simply let it go. Where is he now? Alden asked his grandmother. I have no address more recent than this final letter, Wilhelmina admitted. It was sent from a town some distance east of here, a place called Renwick, if I recall correctly. Whether he remains there after all this time, I cannot say. Alden looked at Elira, decision already forming behind his eyes. Then Renwick is where we go next. They departed within the hour, leaving Wilhelmina with additional staff stationed at every entrance, and a promise from Alden to send word the moment they learned anything further. The road to Renwick took the better part of a day, winding through country that grew increasingly unfamiliar, small towns giving way to quiet farming villages where strangers drew notice quickly. Renwick itself proved modest, a cluster of shops and homes gathered around a central square, its residents eyeing the unfamiliar carriage with open curiosity as it passed. Elira suggested they begin at the local tavern, reasoning that news, whether recent or decades old, tended to gather wherever people gathered to drink and talk. The tavern keeper, a heavy-set man with a weathered face, recognized the name Oswin Caro immediately, though his expression grew guarded the moment Alden asked after him. "Old Caro," he said slowly, wiping a mug that did not need further cleaning. "Lived here some years back, kept mostly to himself. Odd fellow, always looking over his shoulder like he expected someone to come collecting a debt he owed." "Is he still in Renwick?" Elira asked. "Passed on, must be 4 years now. Fever took him quick, one winter. No family came to claim his belongings, so the parish saw to burying him proper enough." Alden's shoulders sank with disappointment, though Elira pressed further, unwilling to let the trail end so easily. "Did he leave any papers behind? Letters, records, anything at all?" The tavern keeper considered this for a long moment. "There was a trunk, I believe. The parish clerk kept it, thinking someone might eventually come asking after his effects. Been sitting in the church storeroom ever since, far as I know. Say, they found the parish clerk within the hour, an elderly man who seemed almost relieved to finally hand off a responsibility he had carried reluctantly for years. The trunk, when opened, revealed little of value at first glance. Worn clothing, a few personal effects, and beneath it all, wrapped carefully in oilcloth to protect it from damp, a stack of papers that made Elira's pulse quicken the moment she saw the familiar handwriting from Ashcomb's ledgers. "These are his personal records," she said, sorting through them carefully under the dim light of the storeroom, separate from what he kept for the estate itself. "It looks as though he tracked every payment he ever authorized, along with notes explaining why." Alden crouched beside her, reading over her shoulder as she uncovered page after page of careful, cramped writing. One entry, dated only weeks after the fire at Ashcombe, stopped them both cold. "Paid to C. Pride as arranged, on instruction from E. Farrow, in exchange for her continued silence regarding the events of the fire, and her assurance that no further inquiry would be made into the circumstances of the late Duke's death." He knew, Alden said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Caro knew Cassandra was being paid for silence, and he wrote it down plainly, as though keeping careful records was more important to him than doing what was right. "Perhaps he feared refusing," Elira said. "A steward with no title and little protection, caught between a grieving family and men willing to burn a house down to protect their secrets. It would take considerable courage to refuse such instructions outright, courage Caro may simply not have possessed." She continued reading, uncovering further entries that painted a clearer picture with each page. Payments authorized on instruction from Edmund Farrow, careful notes tracking every quarter's sum, and finally, near the bottom of the stack, a single entry that answered a question none of them had yet dared to ask aloud. "E. Farrow confirmed to me privately that the fire was set deliberately, to destroy the portrait and the study's records before the late Duke could complete his intended exposure of the missing venture funds. G. Farrow was present that night as well, though E. Farrow insisted the death itself was accident, the Duke having returned to the room unexpectedly while the fire was still being set." Elira read the words twice, making certain she understood them fully before speaking. "It was not meant to kill him, at least according to this account. The fire was meant to destroy evidence. Your grandfather's death may have been accident within a deliberate crime, rather than intended murder from the start." "Does that matter?" Alden asked, his voice hard. "They set a fire in his own home to hide their theft, and he died because of it. Whether they intended his death or not, they are responsible for it entirely." "You are right," Elira said gently. "I only meant that understanding exactly what happened may matter a great deal, should this ever be brought before a magistrate. Intent shapes justice, even when it does not lessen grief." Alden gathered the remaining papers carefully, wrapping them once more in the oilcloth that had protected them for 4 years in a forgotten storeroom. "We have enough now to know the shape of what happened. Edmund Farrow ordered the fire. Gareth Farrow was present. Cassandra was paid for her silence. And Oswin Caro carried the guilt of authorizing those payments until his final days, without ever finding the courage to bring the truth forward himself. What we do not yet know, Alira said, is where Edmund and Gareth Farrow are now, 30 years later, and whether either of them remains alive to answer for what they did. And Cassandra, Alden added grimly, who has spent 30 years pretending grief over a broken engagement, while quietly urging me to sell the very house that holds proof of her silence. They thanked the parish clerk and made their way back toward the carriage as evening settled over Renwick's quiet square, the weight of Caro's confession heavy between them. Alira glanced back once toward the church storeroom, thinking of the steward who had died alone, carrying a truth he never found the strength to speak, and she found herself grateful, in a way she had not expected, that his careful, guilty record-keeping had finally given someone else the courage to finish what he could not. Cassandra will not welcome what we now know, Alden said as they climbed into the carriage. No, Alira agreed, and a woman cornered after 30 years of careful silence rarely surrenders that silence gently. We should be prepared for whatever she chooses to do next, whether that is further denial or something considerably more dangerous. They stopped for the night at a small inn along the road back toward the capital, the innkeeper's wife setting out a simple meal of bread and stew that neither of them had much appetite for. Alden sat with Caro's papers spread across the table, reading through the entries again as though searching for some detail he might have missed the first time. There is something else here, he said after a long silence, pointing to a faded line near the edge of one page. A mention of a solicitor in the capital, a man Caro consulted once, briefly, about whether he bore any legal responsibility for the payments he had authorized under duress. Alira leaned closer to read the name. Percival Ashworth. If he is still practicing, he may remember Caro's visit, and he may know more about what Caro feared at the time. Another thread to follow, Alden said, rubbing his eyes with the weariness of a man who had slept little in 3 days. How many more will there be before we reach the end of this? As many as it takes, Alira said gently. You did not begin this searching for an easy answer, Alden. You began it because you could not bear to build a life on top of a lie. That kind of courage rarely finds a short path. He looked at her across the table, the candlelight catching the exhaustion in his face alongside something steadier underneath it, a resolve that had only grown stronger with each new discovery rather than weakening under the weight of it. You have walked into every part of this beside me, Alira, when you had no obligation to do so beyond the task I first gave you. Choosing a house, that is all I asked of you, and instead, you have helped me uncover a crime 30 years buried. I could not have chosen a house honestly, Alira said, knowing what waited unspoken behind its walls, and I do not believe you could have lived in any home peacefully, Alden. While your grandfather's death remained a wound this family was too afraid to examine. Some choices are not truly choices at all, not when the alternative is simply pretending a wrong never happened. They sat in comfortable silence for a while after that, the fire in the small hearth burning low, both of them turning over the pieces still missing from the picture Caro's records had begun to complete. Somewhere beyond the inn's walls, an owl called once into the darkness, and Alira found herself thinking of Josiah Bram, still keeping his lonely watch over Ashcombe's ruined halls, waiting for word of whatever they might finally bring back to him. Tomorrow we find Ashworth, Alden said finally, gathering the papers back into their oilcloth wrapping, and after that, I think it is time we spoke with Cassandra directly, rather than continuing to circle around what we now know. She will deny everything, Alira warned. Let her deny it, Alden said, his voice quiet but unshakable. I no longer need her confession to know the truth. I only need enough proof to make certain she can never again pretend this family's silence belongs to her to control. Alira nodded, and though the road ahead remained uncertain, she felt for the first time since they had first stood before Ashcombe's broken gate, that they were no longer simply uncovering the past, they were building, piece by careful piece, the case that would finally bring it into the light. A window shattered somewhere on the ground floor of the solicitor's office, just as Alira reached for the door handle, and she froze mid-step, her heart hammering against her ribs before her mind fully caught up to what she had heard. Stay behind me, Alden said sharply, already moving toward the sound. They found Percival Ashworth's clerk standing amid broken glass in the front office, pale and shaking, pointing toward a side room where papers lay scattered across the floor, drawers pulled open and emptied in obvious haste. Someone broke in not 10 minutes past, the clerk said. Mr. Ashworth stepped out for his midday meal, and I was alone in the back room when I heard the glass go. By the time I reached the front, whoever it was had already fled through the side door. What were they after? Alira asked, though she suspected she already knew. The clerk gestured helplessly at the scattered papers. "I cannot say for certain, miss. Mr. Ashworth keeps client files in that cabinet, going back decades. Whoever broke in seemed to be searching for something specific, judging by how thoroughly they went through it." Alden knelt among the papers, sorting through them quickly, his jaw tight with growing frustration. Caro's file. If it was here, it is gone now. Percival Ashworth himself returned moments later, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and an expression of genuine alarm at the state of his office. Once the immediate chaos had settled and the clerk sent to fetch the local constable, Alden explained, carefully and without revealing more than necessary, that they had come seeking information about a former client named Oswin Caro. Ashworth's face grew guarded at the name. "I remember him, yes, though it has been many years since he consulted me. A troubled man, if I recall correctly, seeking advice about obligations he felt bound to honor against his own conscience." "Did he tell you what those obligations involved?" Elira asked. "Only in the vaguest terms. He spoke of payments he had been instructed to make, payments he feared were connected to something far worse than simple estate management. I advised him, as any solicitor would, that if he believed a crime had occurred, his conscience would only be clear through honest disclosure to the proper authorities. He thanked me for my counsel and never returned, and I confess I gave the matter little further thought until this very moment." "Did he name anyone specifically?" Alden pressed. "Any names connected to these payments?" Ashworth hesitated, glancing toward the ransacked cabinet with visible unease. "He mentioned a name once, in passing, though I did not record it formally at the time, believing it irrelevant to the limited advice he sought. Pharaoh, I believe. Yes, I am fairly certain it was Pharaoh." "Which brother?" Elira asked quickly. "I could not say. He spoke the surname only, nothing more specific." It was little enough, but it confirmed what they already suspected, that whoever had broken into the office moments before their arrival had come seeking to remove any remaining trace connecting the Pharaoh name to Caro's confession, proof that someone was still watching their movements closely enough to act on them almost immediately. "They knew we were coming here," Alden said grimly, once they had left Ashworth's office behind, the constable still investigating the scene inside. "Someone followed us from Renwick, or someone learned of our destination before we ever arrived." "Either way," Elira said, "it means the Pharaoh brothers, or whoever remains of their circle, are not simply hiding from the past any longer. They are actively working to bury it further, which tells me they understand exactly how close we now stand to exposing them." Alden's expression hardened with a resolve that had been building steadily since they first stood before Ashcombe's broken gate. "Then we stop circling, and we go directly to Cassandra. Whatever she knows, whatever she has been protecting all these years, I intend to hear it from her own mouth before this goes any further." They arrived at Cassandra Pride's townhouse late that afternoon, and though a servant initially tried to explain that the lady was not receiving visitors, Alden pushed past with a firmness that left no room for argument, Elira close behind him. They found Cassandra in her sitting room, and the moment she saw their faces, whatever composed mask she typically wore began to slip. "Cousin, this is hardly proper, arriving unannounced." "We found the ledgers, Cassandra," Alden said, cutting through her protest without hesitation. "Payments made to you from Ashcombe's accounts for years, stopping the exact year my grandfather died. We found Caro's private records, describing those payments as compensation for your silence, arranged by Edmund Pharaoh himself." Cassandra's face drained of color, her hand rising instinctively to her throat. "I do not know what you are speaking of." "We also know someone broke into a solicitor's office in the capital not 2 hours ago, searching for any remaining record connecting the Pharaoh name to what happened at Ashcombe," Elira added. "That is not the behavior of people confident their secrets will remain buried much longer." "You have no right to accuse me of anything," Cassandra said, though her voice trembled now, the practiced composure finally cracking under the weight of evidence she could no longer simply dismiss. "I am not accusing you of setting the fire yourself," Alden said, his voice quieter now but no less firm. "I believe Edmund Pharaoh did that, with his brother Gareth present. But you accepted payment for your silence afterward, Cassandra. Silence that let 2 men escape any consequence for my grandfather's death, and silence you have maintained for 30 years, while urging me, only weeks ago, to sell the very house that holds proof of what you did." Cassandra sank into a chair, her carefully maintained composure finally giving way entirely. For a long moment she said nothing, staring at her own hands as though searching them for some explanation she could offer that might soften what was coming. "I was young," she finally whispered, "barely 20, and Edmund had convinced me he loved me, that we would marry once his business affairs settled. When the fire happened, And your grandfather died. I did not understand at first what role Edmund had played. It was only after, when he began sending money through Caro and warning me never to speak of that night, that I understood how deeply I had already been drawn into something I could not escape. You could have gone to the authorities, Elira said, not unkindly, but firmly. You could have told your family what you suspected, and accused a man I believed I loved, based on suspicion alone, while risking whatever protection his silence money offered my own family? Cassandra's voice broke. I was frightened, Elira. I told myself for years that speaking would change nothing, that your grandfather was already gone and nothing I said could bring him back. It was easier to accept the money and stay quiet than to face what accepting it truly meant about my own conscience. Where is Edmund Farrow now? Alden asked. I do not know, Cassandra said. He vanished from my life entirely within a month of the fire, and I have had no contact with him in 30 years. I assumed, for a long time, that he had simply moved on to some new venture, some new fortune built on whatever he stole from your grandfather's investment. It was only recently, when you began asking about Ashcombe, that I grew afraid the past might finally catch up with both of us. Someone is still protecting his secrets, Elira said. Someone broke into that solicitor's office today, and someone followed us on the road 2 nights past, wearing a pin bearing the Farrow crest. If Edmund himself is not behind this, then his brother Gareth may still be active, or someone loyal to their name remains determined to keep the truth buried. Cassandra's eyes widened with genuine fear at this. Gareth was always the more dangerous of the two, quieter, more careful. If he believes you are close to exposing what happened, he will not simply allow it to happen without a fight. You must be careful, both of you. I have lived 30 years afraid of what these men might still be capable of, and I do not believe that fear was misplaced. Will you testify to what you know? Alden asked. Before a magistrate, if it comes to that. Cassandra was silent for a long moment, visibly wrestling with 30 years of carefully guarded fear. Finally she nodded, slowly, tears finally spilling free down her face. Yes, I have carried this long enough, cousin. I am tired of pretending grief for a man who helped destroy your family, when the truth is, I have simply been too frightened to say what I know. If speaking now can finally end that fear, then I will speak, whatever it costs me. Alden studied her for a long moment, the anger in his expression softening slightly into something more complicated. Not quite forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Thank you, Cassandra. I do not excuse what you did, but I recognize the courage it takes to finally set it down after so long. They left her townhouse as evening settled over the city, both of them silent with the weight of what had just been confirmed. As they climbed into the carriage, Elira glanced back toward the house and saw, for just a moment, a figure standing across the street in the shadow of a doorway, watching them with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Alden, she said quietly, we are being watched right now. He followed her gaze, but by the time he turned, the figure had already melted back into the darkness of the street, leaving nothing behind but the uneasy certainty that whoever remained loyal to the Farrow name knew exactly how close the truth had finally come to the surface, and was no longer content to simply watch from a distance. They had barely traveled 2 streets when the carriage lurched violently, throwing Elira against the side panel as Peter shouted from the driver's seat, pulling hard on the reins. Through the small window, Alden saw a second carriage had cut sharply across their path, forcing their own horses to rear in fright. Stay down, Alden said, pulling Elira away from the window as the door on her side rattled with someone testing the handle from outside. Open this door, a voice demanded, low and controlled, entirely unfamiliar. We have no wish to harm you, only to speak. Then speak from where you stand, Alden called back, his hand closing around the small pistol he had begun carrying since the incident at the inn 2 nights before. We are not opening this door to strangers who block our path in the street. There was a pause, and then the voice spoke again, closer now to the window. My name is Gareth Farrow. I believe you have been asking a great many questions that concern my family, and I think it is past time we settled this matter directly, rather than through broken windows and ransacked offices. Elira felt Alden go rigid beside her, though his voice remained steady when he answered. Then settle it plainly. Tell me what happened to my grandfather. Your grandfather, Gareth said, his voice carrying a weariness that surprised Elira, made a foolish decision to threaten men who had already lost everything in a venture gone wrong. My brother panicked. He believed destroying the evidence of our losses would protect us both from ruin, and I was too much a coward that night to stop him from setting that fire, though I swear to you, on whatever honor remains to my name, that neither of us intended for your grandfather to die. He was meant to be away from the house that evening. He returned earlier than expected, and by the time we realized he was inside, the fire had already spread too far to safely reach him. And you have spent 30 years hiding that truth instead of confessing it, Alden said, his voice tight with barely restrained fury. Yes, Gareth admitted, and something in his tone suggested this confession, spoken aloud after 3 decades of silence, cost him more than either of them could easily measure. Edmund fled abroad within weeks, unable to live with what we had done, and I have spent every year since managing what remained of our family's business quietly, paying whatever was necessary to keep the truth buried, telling myself I was protecting what little honor our name had left, rather than admitting I was simply too afraid to face what I had allowed to happen. Why come to us now, tonight, in the street, rather than simply continuing to hide as you have for 30 years? Elira asked, leaning toward the window despite Alden's protective hand on her arm. Because Cassandra sent word to me not an hour ago, warning me that she intended to speak the truth before a magistrate, Gareth said. And because I find, after 30 years, that I no longer have the strength to keep running from what happened in that house. I did not come tonight to silence you, Duke Whitmore, whatever fear my sudden appearance may have caused. I came to tell you the truth myself, before you learned only pieces of it secondhand, and to tell you that I will stand before whatever court you choose to bring this matter, and answer for my part in it honestly, at last. The street fell silent except for the restless shifting of the horses, both carriages still blocking the narrow road. Alden studied the shadow of the man standing just beyond the carriage door, searching for any sign of deception in a voice that had, until this moment, carried nothing but weary honesty. And your brother, Alden said finally. Where is Edmund now? Dead, Gareth said quietly. Nearly 10 years passed, in a foreign port, of a fever that took him quickly. He never returned to England, and he never stopped writing to me of his guilt in his final years, guilt he could never bring himself to confess publicly while he lived. I am the only one left who can answer for what happened that night, Duke Whitmore, and I intend to do so, whatever the consequence to what remains of my life. Alden lowered the pistol slowly, though he did not fully release the tension in his shoulders. Open the door, Elira. I believe him. She hesitated only a moment before releasing the latch, and Gareth Farrow stepped into the lamplight for the first time, an older man with tired eyes, and a bearing that spoke of a lifetime spent carrying weight far heavier than his thin frame appeared able to hold. He made no move toward violence, only stood quietly, waiting for whatever judgment they chose to deliver. You will come with us tomorrow, Alden said, to speak with my grandmother, and after that, to whatever magistrate agrees to hear this case formally. I want every detail recorded, Gareth Farrow, every payment, every decision, everything that happened in that house the night my grandfather died. I will hold nothing back, Gareth said. I have held it back for 30 years, and I find I no longer have the strength, nor the wish, to carry it silently any further. As the 2 carriages finally separated and continued on their separate ways through the darkened streets, Elira sat quietly beside Alden, watching his face in the dim lamplight as the full weight of what had just happened began to settle over him. It is nearly finished, she said softly. Not finished, Alden replied, though something in his voice had eased considerably since the confrontation began. But finally, after 30 years, it is being told honestly, and I think that matters more than I understood before tonight. The magistrate's chamber fell utterly silent the moment Gareth Farrow finished reading his written confession aloud. 30 years of carefully guarded secrets finally spoken plainly, before witnesses who could no longer be ignored or bought into silence. Alden stood near the front of the room beside his grandmother, watching the proceedings with a tightness in his chest that had not eased since they entered the building that morning. Wilhelmina sat straight back despite her age, her hands folded calmly in her lap, though Elira noticed the way her fingers occasionally trembled against the fabric of her dress, the strain of finally facing what she had spent 30 years avoiding clearly costing her something even now. Cassandra had already given her own testimony an hour earlier, her voice breaking several times as she described the payments, the fear, the years of carrying guilt she had never found the courage to set down until now. The magistrate, an older man with sharp eyes and little patience for evasion, had listened carefully to every word, occasionally asking pointed questions that left no room for softened truths. You understand, the magistrate said now, addressing Gareth directly, that a confession such as this, regarding events 30 years past, carries significant legal complexity. Your brother, being deceased, cannot answer for his own actions, and much of what you describe relies on your word alone, corroborated by documents and testimony that, while compelling, were gathered through unconventional means. I understand fully, Gareth said quietly. I do not come before you seeking leniency, sir, I come seeking only to finally speak the truth, whatever judgment follows from it. I have lived 30 years knowing what my silence cost this family, and I would rather face whatever consequence the law demands than carry that weight into my grave as my brother did." The magistrate studied him for a long moment, then turned to Alden. "Duke Whitmore, this matter touches your family most directly. What resolution do you seek?" Alden had considered this question carefully in the days leading to this hearing, turning it over during long, sleepless nights, weighing anger against the strange, unexpected sense of closure that Gareth's honesty had brought him. "I do not seek vengeance, sir. My grandfather is 30 years gone, and no punishment delivered today will return him to this family. What I seek is simply this: a full and formal record of the truth, so that Ashcombe Manor need no longer stand as a monument to unanswered questions, and so that my family, and Cassandra Pride, and even Gareth Farrow himself, might finally set down a burden that has weighed on all of us for far too long." The magistrate nodded slowly, clearly moved by the unusual grace in Alden's answer. "Then let the record show that this matter has been formally investigated and confessed, that Edmund Farrow, deceased, bears primary responsibility for the fire that caused the death of the late Duke Whitmore, that Gareth Farrow bears responsibility as an accessory to the concealment of that crime, and that appropriate restitution shall be arranged between the parties involved, as befits a matter of this age and complexity." The proceedings concluded shortly after, and as they stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, Elira felt the weight that had settled over her since they first stood before Ashcombe's broken gate finally begin to lift, replaced by something lighter, something that felt almost like hope. Wilhelmina took Alden's hands in her own, tears finally falling freely down her weathered face without any attempt to hide them. "Your grandfather would be proud of you, Alden. I spent 30 years believing silence was the only way to protect this family. You have shown me it was never protection at all, only a slower kind of harm. I could not have done it without Elira," Alden said, glancing toward her with an expression that made Elira's cheeks warm despite herself. "She saw what I could not see, and she gave me the courage to ask questions I had spent my whole life avoiding." They returned to Ashcombe together the following week, the four of them, Alden, Elira, Wilhelmina, and Cassandra, who had asked, quietly and with genuine humility, to see the house one final time, now that its secrets no longer needed protecting. Josiah Bram met them at the gate exactly as he had the first time, though his weathered face now carried something new, a lightness that had been absent during their first visit. "You found it," he said simply. "Whatever you went looking for that day, you found it." "We found all of it," Alden confirmed. "The truth, at last, fully spoken and formally recorded. Through." Josiah's eyes filled with unexpected tears as he looked toward the manor's broken windows, 30 years of solitary vigil finally reaching its end. "Then I suppose an old man can finally rest easy, knowing his watch is finished." "Not finished," Alden said, and something in his voice made Josiah turn back to face him with sudden attention. "I intend to restore this house, Josiah, fully and properly, and I would like you to remain here as its caretaker, this time with the family's full knowledge and gratitude, rather than in secret." Josiah's weathered composure broke entirely then, and he wiped at his eyes with the back of a worn sleeve, unable to speak for a long moment. "It would be my honor, sir. I never stopped believing someone would come asking the right questions eventually. I only feared I would not live long enough to see it happen." They walked through the manor together that afternoon, and though the scars of that terrible night 30 years past remained visible in every blackened stone and broken window, Elira found herself imagining, for the first time, what the house might look like restored. Gardens replanted, windows repaired, rooms filled once more with light and voices rather than silence and dust. Wilhelmina lingered longest in the burned study, standing quietly before the empty portrait frame, and when she finally turned to leave, something in her bearing had eased, as though she had finally allowed herself to properly grieve a husband whose death she had spent 30 years unable to fully mourn. "I would like the portrait recreated," she said softly, "once the frame is restored. I remember his face well enough to guide an artist, and I think it is time this house held his memory honestly again, rather than an empty space where truth once hung." "I will see it done," Alden promised. Over the following months, Ashcombe Manor transformed slowly, scaffolding rising against blackened stone, gardens cleared of decades of overgrowth, the burned study rebuilt with careful attention to preserving what memory deserved preserving, while making space for new life to grow around it. Alden threw himself into the restoration with an energy that surprised even Wilhelmina, spending long days at the property overseeing workmen, consulting with architects, and always, in every quiet evening afterward, discussing the day's progress with Alira over simple suppers that had become, without either of them quite acknowledging it, the best part of each day. "You never finish choosing," Alira said one evening, several months into the restoration, as they sat together on the Manor's newly repaired terrace, watching the sun set over gardens beginning to bloom again for the first time in 30 years. "You still have 2 other properties waiting for your decision." Alden smiled, the expression coming easier to him now than it had when she first met him, grief-stricken and uncertain in his father's study. "I made my choice the day we first walked through that broken gate, Alira, though I did not fully understand it until much later. This house needed someone brave enough to ask what happened inside it. I needed a place that would demand honesty from me, rather than simply offering comfort. Ashcombe gave me both." "And now?" she asked. "Now that the truth is spoken and the house is nearly restored, what does it offer you?" He turned to look at her fully, something warm and certain in his expression that had been building slowly, quietly, through every shared discovery and every dangerous night on the road together. "Now, I think, it offers me the chance to build something new here, something worth the truth we fought to uncover. I do not wish to build it alone, Alira. I have known that for some time now, though I confess I lacked the courage to say it plainly until this moment." Alira felt her heart quicken, understanding the weight behind his words even before he finished speaking them. "Alden, I am not asking you to answer tonight," he said gently, taking her hand in his. "I only wanted you to know, clearly and honestly, exactly as this house has taught me to be, that whatever choice remains ahead of us, I hope it is one we make together." The garden around them had bloomed fuller than either of them had noticed while they spoke, roses climbing the newly repaired trellises, the fountain in the courtyard finally running clear water again after decades of silence and neglect. Somewhere beyond the terrace, Josiah's laughter carried faintly on the evening air, as he showed a group of new staff around grounds he had guarded alone for so many lonely years, and Alira understood, watching the light fade gently over a house that had once been feared and was now, slowly, becoming beloved again, that some choices were never truly difficult at all, once the fear surrounding them had finally been allowed to fall away. "Then let us build it together," she said softly, "here, in a house that taught us both what honesty is truly worth." Alden's answering smile held all the warmth of the setting sun spreading gold across Ashcombe's restored stone walls, and as evening settled gently over the manor that had once been feared, and was now, finally, becoming home, neither of them doubted for a single moment that they had chosen exactly right. Word of the family's decision spread quickly through the county in the weeks that followed, and where Ashcombe had once drawn only whispers of fear and warning, it now drew curiosity, then admiration, as neighbors began to see the scaffolding come down and the gardens bloom fuller with each passing month. Wilhelmina visited often, staying for longer stretches each time, and Alira noticed how the Dowager Duchess's laughter came more easily now, unburdened at last from 30 years of careful silence. Cassandra, too, found her way back into the family's graces slowly, her formal testimony before the magistrate having settled whatever legal complications remained, and Alden, true to the grace he had shown throughout the entire ordeal, chose not to hold her past against her indefinitely. She visited Ashcombe on occasion, always a little quieter than she had once been, always carrying a gratitude in her eyes that needed no words to be understood. Gareth Farrow's fate proved gentler than perhaps he expected, the magistrate ultimately ordering restitution paid to the Whitmore family rather than harsher punishment, given his age, his voluntary confession, and the 3 decades that had already passed since the crime itself. He wrote to Alden once, several months after the hearing concluded, a short letter expressing gratitude for the mercy shown him, and Alden kept the letter, though he never quite decided whether he had fully forgiven the man who wrote it. Some wounds, he had come to understand, did not require forgiveness to finally heal. They required only truth, and truth, at last, had been given fully. The portrait was completed in early autumn, a skilled artist working carefully from Wilhelmina's detailed memory, and a handful of surviving sketches found among old family papers, and when it was finally hung once more in the rebuilt study, the old Duke's kind face looking out over a room no longer scarred by fire or secrets, Wilhelmina stood before it for a long while in quiet contemplation, and Alira, watching from the doorway, saw her lips move silently, as though speaking, at last, the words she had been unable to say for 30 long years. Josiah settled into his new role with a quiet pride that touched everyone who witnessed it, training the younger staff in the manor's history, though he was always careful now to tell the story honestly, no longer a tale of curses and avoidance, but one of patience finally rewarded, and truth finally spoken. He kept the small garden behind the manor tended with particular care, The stone marker that had once held a buried ring, now serving as a quiet memorial, rather than a hidden grave for secrets, a simple engraving added at Alden's request, marking not a death, but the beginning of a truth finally allowed to breathe. As the first frost of winter settled over Ashcomb's grounds, Alden stood once more on the terrace where he had spoken his heart to Elira months before, watching smoke rise gently from the manor's many restored chimneys, warm light glowing in windows that had stood dark and broken for 30 years. Elira joined him there, wrapping a shawl closer against the evening chill, and together they watched the house settle into its first proper winter in 3 decades, no longer a ruin avoided by all who knew its history, but a home rebuilt on nothing less than the truth it had finally been allowed to tell. "Your grandmother asked me today when we intend to marry," Elira said, a small smile playing at her lips. "And what did you tell her?" Alden asked. "That I thought it only right to let this house finish its own restoration first, before we asked it to hold a wedding within its walls." Elira looked up at him, her expression softening. "Though I confess, watching it come back to life these past months, I no longer think we need to wait very much longer at all." Alden laughed, the sound carrying warmly across the quiet garden, and pulled her closer against the winter air. "Then let us tell her spring, once the roses bloom fully again, and this house stands entirely as it was always meant to be." "Spring," Elira agreed softly, resting her head against his shoulder as the last light faded gently over Ashcomb's restored walls. "I think that sounds exactly right." Rose petals scattered across the terrace stones the moment the spring wind swept through Ashcomb's gardens, and Elira laughed as she caught one against her sleeve, standing at the edge of the courtyard in a gown of pale blue silk, while the household bustled around her in final preparation for the day ahead. "You are not meant to see the bride fussing over her own petals," Wilhelmina said fondly, appearing at her side with a gentle smile that had become far more common on her face in the months since the truth of Ashcombe had finally been spoken. "Come inside. There is still your hair to finish, and a groom somewhere in this house who is undoubtedly pacing far more than is good for his nerves." Elira allowed herself to be led inside, past hallways that had once stood blackened and silent, now bright with fresh paint and warm afternoon light pouring through windows repaired to their original glory. It was strange, she thought, how thoroughly a house could transform in the span of a single year. How 30 years of fear and avoidance could give way so completely to laughter and life, once the truth beneath it had finally been allowed to surface. In a room down the hall, Alden stood before a mirror, adjusting his collar for perhaps the 10th time that morning, while Josiah watched with barely concealed amusement from a nearby chair. "You will wear a hole in that collar if you keep pulling at it, sir," Josiah said. "I have never been more nervous in my life," Alden admitted, "and I once stood in a dark carriage negotiating with a man I believed might mean me harm." "Marriage asks a different kind of courage," Josiah said, rising to help straighten Alden's coat with the same careful attention he had once given to guarding this house's secrets, "though I suspect you have already proven, this past year, that you possess courage enough for whatever comes next." Alden smiled at that, thinking of everything the past year had brought, the fear and the danger, but also the deep and quiet satisfaction of watching a house rebuild itself stone by stone, and watching a family, his family, finally learn to speak honestly with one another after 30 years of careful silence. He thought of Cassandra, who had written recently to say she intended to travel abroad for a time, seeking, in her own words, a fresh beginning far from the shadows that had followed her for so long. He thought of Gareth Farrow, whose final letter had arrived only weeks ago, gentler in tone than the ones before it, as though the old man had finally found some measure of peace in his final years. And he thought of his grandfather, whose portrait now hung once more in the rebuilt study, watching over a house that had finally been allowed to heal. He would have liked her, Alden said quietly, more to himself than to Josiah. "Your grandfather?" Josiah asked. "Elira, I think he would have admired her courage, the way she refused to let a comfortable lie stand simply because the truth was difficult to uncover." Josiah's weathered face softened with genuine warmth. "I believe you are right, sir. And I believe, wherever he rests now, he is glad to see this house finally standing whole again, filled with the kind of honesty he was trying to protect the very night he died." The ceremony took place in the Manor's restored garden as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward evening. Guests gathered among roses that had bloomed fuller than anyone could remember, the fountain running clear and bright at the courtyard's center. Wilhelmina sat in the front row, dabbing gently at her eyes throughout, while a small gathering of neighbors and family watched with genuine warmth, no longer whispering fearful stories about the house behind them, but celebrating instead its remarkable return to life. Elira walked down the garden path on no one's arm but her own, having quietly insisted, weeks earlier, that she wished to arrive at this moment as the woman who had chosen this path herself, just as she had once been asked to choose this very house. Alden watched her approach with an expression of such open, unguarded joy that Wilhelmina, watching her grandson's face, felt her own heart swell with a happiness she had not allowed herself to fully feel in 30 long years. The vows they exchanged were simple, honest, entirely their own, each of them speaking plainly of the courage they had found in each other, the truth they had uncovered together, and the home they intended to build honestly, without secrets, for whatever years remained ahead of them. When Alden finally kissed his new bride beneath the fading afternoon light, the garden erupted into warm applause, and somewhere above them, a flock of birds startled up from the manor's newly repaired roofline, wheeling once across the golden sky, before settling again into the eaves that had, for 30 years, sheltered only silence and secrets, and now sheltered laughter instead. That evening, as the wedding celebration continued in the great hall below, Elira slipped away briefly to stand alone in the garden, looking up at the manor's restored windows glowing warm with candlelight against the darkening sky. She thought of the first time she had seen this house, broken and forbidding on its lonely hill, and of Josiah's warning at the gate, and of the long, uncertain road that had led them from that frightened first evening to this warm and celebrated one. "You are hiding from your own wedding," Alden said, finding her there a few minutes later, his coat slightly loosened, his face flushed with warmth and happiness. "Only for a moment," Elira said, smiling as he came to stand beside her. "I wanted to remember what this garden looked like the first time we stood in it, so I could properly appreciate what it has become." Alden followed her gaze toward the restored stone marker in the corner of the garden, now bearing its simple engraving honoring truth rather than concealment. "Josiah told me, earlier today, that he believes my grandfather would have liked you very much." "I hope that is true," Elira said softly. "I know it is," Alden said, taking her hand in his. "You gave this family something it had been missing for 30 years, Elira. Not just the truth, though that mattered more than I can properly say. You gave us the courage to finally stop being afraid of our own history." Elira leaned into him, watching the candlelight flicker warmly in the manor's windows, the sound of laughter and music drifting gently across the garden from the celebration still continuing inside. "This house asked us to choose something difficult, Alden, and I think that is exactly why it was worth choosing at all. Comfortable choices rarely teach us anything worth knowing. It is the difficult ones, the ones everyone else avoids, that usually lead somewhere worth arriving." "Then I am glad," Alden said, drawing her closer beneath the darkening sky, "that you were the one asked to choose it." Behind them, Ashcombe Manor stood bright and whole against the night, no longer a ruin that everyone avoided, but a home finally restored to everything it had always been meant to become, its walls holding not secrets any longer, but the quiet, steady warmth of a family that had finally learned the true cost and the true reward of choosing honesty over fear.